So, hello and welcome to today's webinar 2024 Trends in Clinical Trials. So, what we're going to do is look at some of the exciting developments we're expecting in 2024 and some beyond in clinical trials, particularly in clinical trial design. And we're going to talk about two specific areas. We're going to talk about complex trial designs, so things like adaptive design, complex innovative design program, platform trials, and then the impact emerging technologies are having on clinical trials as well, focusing in particular on artificial intelligence and machine learning, and also on decentralized trials. Before we get started, just a few common questions. Is this webinar being recorded? Yes, and the slides and recording will be sent to you after this webinar is complete. So hopefully later today, but at latest tomorrow. If you have any questions or technical issues, please put them into the questions tab on the right-hand side of the webinar software. If I have time, I'll answer some of the questions at the end. Otherwise, I'll respond via email after the webinar is complete, either later today or tomorrow. Okay, so with that out of the way, let's get into today's webinar's 2024 Trends in Clinical Trials, demonstrated on NCRE. So what we want to talk about today is really, what happened in 2023 and what's happened oftentimes in relation to the COVID-19 pandemic and the lessons thereof, and then where is that going to lead us in the near future. Before we go any further, my name is Ron Fitzpatrick. I'm the lead statistician here at NCRE. I'm very excited to talk about these topics today and also briefly show you some of the relevant areas in NCRE, how it can help you with your clinical trial designs, and also talk about some of the plans for NCRE and how they intersect with these developments. So what we want to see first here is talk about these developments in complex trials. So we're going to talk about adaptive design, some of the interesting developments there. Then we're going to talk about complex innovative designs, of which platform trials are often associated with as a subset of that wider area. And then for emerging technologies in clinical trials, we're going to talk about the impact of artificial intelligence and machine learning, or AI and ML, and then also talk about decentralized clinical trials growth. And we'll have discussion conclusions at the end. Just a note that the save files that of all the examples shown here will also be provided alongside the slides of recording after the webinar is complete. As mentioned before, today's webinar is demonstrated on NCRE, your complete solution for optimizing your clinical trial. And NCRE is a widely used software for clinical trial design aspects such as sample size and power calculations, adaptive design, simulation, ranging from preclinical research to confirmatory trials to post-marketing surveillance. NCRE is very widely used in the pharmaceutical and biotechnology industries, with nearly 90% of organizations having a license of NCRE who had trials approved by the FDA. And you can see some of the reviews here. So with that out of the way, let's get into kind of what are we going to talk about today? Well, I think first let's provide some context on where we're coming from after a very exciting 2023. And obviously, I'm hoping everyone had a very delightful holiday period after as we come into the early weeks of 2024. So I think what we saw in 2023 was a major acceleration in the usage of innovative approaches building in trials. And I think that was prompted kind of by two main factors. I think the obvious one, and the one that probably everyone's aware of, is that COVID-19 had a substantial impact on what was considered possible, basically the space of what could be considered conceivable in clinical trial design. So that's things like, decentralized clinical trials suddenly exploding as trials which were ongoing had to adapt to the fact that you had people unable to come to hospitals and stuff, and then resources in hospitals not being available for clinical trials anymore. You saw, major developments in how vaccines can be approved via accelerated approval using group structural design, something which would be relatively rare in the vaccine space. And we saw, the finding of many therapeutics for COVID-19 via platform trials such as Recovery and Remap-Cap. So those were all major developments, and they've all really changed what we think is possible in clinical trials. And we saw a lot of that impact in 2023, and we're going to see a lot more of that in 2024 and beyond. But we're also seeing, this building openness to innovation in the clinical trial space from regulators, and specifically coming from outside factors. So, you have the Innovative Cures Act, you have the FDA Reform Act passed recently, and this is all outlined in these PDUFA letters sent by the FDA, for example, which are very much more open. And I think the biggest change I'd say over the last 10 years is that the FDA is all about open communication. If you come early in good faith, then there's a greater openness to considering innovative approaches, whether that be innovative statistical approaches like adaptive design or Bayesian approaches, or for innovative trial aspects such as decentralizing the trial, having remote evaluation using digital health endpoints, etc. And so what I think, as 2023 saw the wind down officially of the COVID-19 regulations, so I think the FDA, those are all now officially wound down, and I think similarly for the EMA, the idea is that those lessons will hopefully inform what we want to do going forward. And these novel approaches can help tackle the long-running concern about the increasing cost and increasing failure rates of clinical trials over the last, 2 decades or so. However, I would strike a note of caution. Like obviously, the circumstances of a pandemic are quite different from normal action, as it were. And so you might see now those deliberations, which were kind of put to the side initially, because we needed to get things fast, that those will now come back in, and we'll need to have a more considered debate about the specifics of how we want to apply these innovations to ensure not only that they provide the increased efficiency and faster, treatments to market, but also that we're balancing that with ensuring statistical and trial integrity as we go forward. And so in this webinar, what I want to do is look at these kind of two broad areas that they're kind of linked together as well, because honestly, many of these innovations, especially decentralized trials, kind of mix in with these complex designs. But talk about complex design, so adaptive design, CID, platform trials, and then technologies like AI, ML, and decentralized trials, and their impact specifically on the clinical trial process, and probably biased more towards the confirmatory and phase 3 type trials. So let's get straight into the first section, complex trial design. And so I suppose, I talked about kind of 3 levels. I'm going to talk about adaptive design first, but really adaptive design is only one aspect of the kind of wider innovative approaches that are coming down the track. But adaptive design was kind of I want to say the canary in the coal mine, because adaptive design is already, starting to become a standard part of the toolkit, or certainly many types of adaptive design have become a standard part of the toolkit when considering how you want to make your trial as efficient as possible. So for example, group sequential design is basically a well understood, very approachable method if you wanted to stop a trial early. And now, as we said, applied to even vaccines, an area which traditionally wouldn't have been open to, albeit in an emergency situation. And so adaptive design, for anyone who's unclear, is a case where you're going to make a change or decision about the trial while it is still ongoing. So you might be stopping the trial early because you have a very strong signal for success or for failure, or efficacy and futility. It's often referred to sample size re-estimation, SSR, adaptive randomization. So you might randomize more subjects based on the outcome variable. So arms that are doing better, you might give more to them. So that's response adaptive randomization. Or you may want to provide more to certain subgroups or certain based on covariates. So that would be covariate adjusted randomization. And there's a whole bunch of other types of adaptive designs as well. And the idea here is that adaptive design can hopefully lead to a more efficient trial. So the way I think of it is if you knew exactly what was going to happen beforehand, you could design the perfect trial that balances, ensuring that you have a high probability of success while minimizing the cost, increasing the efficiency. And effectively, we have to make a lot of assumptions when we're designing our trial because obviously we don't know what's happening. Otherwise, why would we have the clinical trial? And the adaptive design hopefully moves you closer from where you actually started to what that optimal trial would have been as the information becomes available. So as information becomes available, you now know more than you did beforehand. Why not move closer to that trial? And I think, that's obviously a really tempting proposal. But I do think careful planning is still very important, and in the context of clinical trials, pre-specification, which is to say the choices when you're going to make them, what choices you can make, what are the space of possible outcomes from those choices. Those all need to be predefined in the context of a clinical trial, particularly a confirmatory clinical trial. Now, obviously, protocol deviations have been around forever, but adaptive design is where we're talking about these being planned, not just kind of happening in relation to something we just didn't see coming. And I think, sometimes an adaptive design might sound fancy or new, but it might just not be as efficient as just using a more standard trial. So for example, if you were considering sample size re-estimation, a promising zone design, you should certainly consider its efficiency over a wide variety of scenarios compared to just the bog standard group sequential design, which may often have many of the same strengths as that SSR type design, which is obviously usually just built on top of a group sequential design regardless. And so what we've seen in the last 20 years is much more acceptance and much more adoption of these. So there's papers about this within the FDA, there's papers about this within the EMA, and the ones which are succeeding. And I think group sequential design is probably the most common by far, but you are seeing these other ones emerge, like seamless designs based on multi-arm, multi-stage type approaches. And in early stage designs, particularly, you're seeing a lot of innovation here. And the hope here is that this will, obviously this is just the start, right? Like we're kind of getting there. We had the new guidance from the FDA in 2019, which had a significant overhaul of the openness and the kind of paradigm for how adaptive designs would be considered. And that is only now filtering through into how open, obviously, sponsors are to doing this type of trials. But as I say, always keep in mind that just because you can do something doesn't mean you should do something. And so you can see here that there's actually lots of really good resources in adaptive design coming online. And one, if you're looking for a more like educational type input, something which kind of will give you a broad level education and lots of links and stuff like that, is the new Panda project that was launched last year. And you can find that there on the right hand side. This is an example, for example, where they talk about, well, what decisions, what ideas should be going through your head when you're picking, should you do an adaptive design, and what type of adaptive design you should do. So what are the trends in adaptive design and how will they lead into 2024? A lot of these are more ongoing over a longer period. So there's, what's specific to 2024 and what's kind of longer term is a little bit hazy, but effectively I would say we'll split into early stage trials and into confirmatory trials. So early stage, which I'll talk about briefly in terms of preclinical, so that's obviously research happening in the field, obviously happening within laboratories and stuff like that. I think adaptive design in general is much more exciting, and I think you're seeing a lot more interest in adaptive design in publicly funded trials, which may or may not be in the kind of phase 3 level trials, but which may be more exploratory type trials. And obviously, as I said, much more interest in these kind of education programs to make this type of technology, these innovations, much more widely available, much more widely understood, not just within like biostatisticians who work within the pharmaceutical industry, but within statisticians and the broader public and the broader research community going forward. So I think what you might see going forward is more people being interested in adaptive design over a wide variety of scenarios, both preclinical and just in general public-oriented research. Getting into more specifically the clinical trial process, phase 1, I think at this point 3+3 is pretty much on the way out. You might see the occasional usage of it, but there was a pretty damning paper and guidance from the FDA, I believe, a few years ago, which basically said that this has really poor statistical operating characteristics, and therefore we need to go away from 3+3. And I think that's happening. But what I think what's interesting, or what I've certainly seen in terms of which methods are kind of winning out to a certain extent, just talking here for a moment about those which are evaluating toxicity only, is that the ones that are winning, so MTPI2, BYN, oftentimes these are the ones which have what I would call a flowchart type output rather than a modeling type approach. And so what do I mean by that? Basically, a flowchart effectively indicates that you would have like if X happens, do Y. And oftentimes this will be like a table with X columns, X rows, and just saying, start at dose 1. If you have do your 3 or 4 or whatever the size of your cohort is, X number of successes go to this level, X number of successes go to this level, and just that kind of almost like a little map going back and forward till you reach one of the cells that's kind of at the end point, almost like a board game to some extent. And so what you're seeing is that the methods which are much more orientated towards creating outputs, which can be then given to the actual, the doctors, researchers on the ground, those are the ones which I think, given that's the kind of the paradigm what 3+3 was, that those are the ones that are still being preferred over, say, the more model statistical heavy ones like CRM or Bayesian logistic regression. Those are kind of similar. And the reason that's happening is basically like, statisticians love modeling, and the modeling does give you a lot of additional output. It gives you estimates, it gives you, interval ranges for the likely, dose response curve. But, for the people on the ground, they, and obviously we're talking here phase 1 where we're trying to establish whether the drug is safe. There's obviously a high degree of caution and they want to have a high degree of certainty. And this almost harks back to, the original development of sequential designs, where, the original, or one of the most famous original sequential designs was the sequential probability ratio test developed by Wald during World War II, because that was designed to be used by people in the field, people who actually radar stations and stuff like that, not by statisticians. And so that was a control chart type sequential design. And then subsequently you saw the development of more, I suppose, statistically oriented methods like group sequential design based on error spending, etc. And so I think it's very interesting. There's kind of almost that kind of development happening here within phase 1. And that's also happening alongside another major development where there's a great interest in phase 1, not just being used to find the toxicity profile, so the dose response curve for toxicity, so the number of adverse events as you increase dose, but also trying to find some level of information on the expected dose response for efficacy, for the actual ability for the drug to reduce to reduce the disease. This is mostly, I would say a lot of these methods are mostly oncology related. For other domains, you're often talking about more standard, like one-arm trial type design. So we're mostly talking about oncology here, to be fair. Oncology is a very large proportion of the trials as well. So that's fair enough. And so you're seeing, for example, the Project Optimus project from the FDA, where they want to talk about developments and innovation in the context of dose response curves at phase 1. And, I think the efficacy thing is part of what people want to get. But I think there is a little bit, I wouldn't say backlash, but back and forth in that, because I think if you're going to talk about efficacy, the sample size requirements may increase. And I think there's been some pushback, I think particularly in pediatrics, that is just not acceptable. That's going to slow things down and mean you can't get to phase 2 quicker, can't get to phase 3, can't get to accelerated approval quicker. And so maybe, the principle is good, but how are you going to do this without compromising, the overall efficiency of phase 1 right now? And there's also other projects like Project Endpoints, similarly on survival, which would have an impact here. So that's what I would say in phase 1. Phase 2, I wouldn't say there's many kind of right now developments in phase 2. I think the biggest change happening right now is that there's much more openness to complex designs, which both include kind of additional adaptive designs, moving away from just the kind of standard 2-stage designs like Simon's and Fleming's, though those are still very widely used, but also in particular more interest in these kind of Bayesian considerations. At phase 2, you aren't really as strongly tied, or you're not even really tied at all, to the 0.025 significance level or type 1 error rate from phase 3. And so I think you're seeing, this is an area where you have sufficient sample sizes. You don't have to squeeze every penny, as it were, so you can actually do these more complex multi-stage designs, and that kind of makes sense, and do that in a way which you're actually bringing in meaningful movements from prior to prior and its likelihood to the posterior. So in a more general sense. So I think Bayesian optimal platforms is what I've heard a lot about. There's some older methods from the 90s, which we've had user requests for. So I think Bayesian approaches in phase 2 will continue to grow, probably the biggest thing over the last year and moving forward. Moving into confirmatory trials, obviously adaptive design, especially after the 2019 FDA guidance update, I think there's a lot of these which are already basically accepted. Group sequential design, pretty much like I'd say group sequential design it's probably almost just like the norm at this point, I would say, because why not do group sequential design? More often than not, it just gives you that extra chance to stop the trial early. So except for certain cases where that may lead to lead to not sufficient safety data, or there may be some objections there. I think group sequential design, if you're in group sequential design in a fixed term trial, you might end up basically having them equally acceptable to regulators. And indeed, they might, if you're fixed term trial, say, why not add some sequential operating characteristics to improve the efficiency. And then some of these other approaches, internal pilot, which is like a blinded sample size re-estimation, blinded sample size re-estimation, or blinded adaptive designs in general, very well accepted. There's very little objection to those, assuming that you can maintain the blind, the operating that's kind of the operational operational aspects that you will need to be most focused on there. And then promising zone is probably one of these ones which there's some debate back and forth on how much value it adds, but I think generally in terms of the operational value and in terms of being controversial, it wouldn't be considered to be controversial at this point, as long as you could show that it actually brings a real and tangible advantage. This idea of like powering for maybe an optimistic effect size, but having the optionality to increase the sample size for cases which would still be clinically meaningful, that still makes a lot of sense. And as I said, a lot of developments here in recent years, the FDA guidance of 2019, the consort extension in the subsequent years, but there is one big thing that will happen in 2024. So you will have the ICH, which is the entity which harmonizes regulations across all of the regulatory agencies, is hoping on its current work plan to publish the publicly available draft of the Adaptive Clinical Trials Guidance, ICH E20, later in 2024. So obviously, I would imagine this will end up looking very similar to what you saw from the FDA and some of the lessons from the EMA and some of the other agencies as well. I think that kind of pre-specify things, use simulation to define operating characteristics, like early engagement with the regulator to ensure that there's no kind of issues that might emerge later on. I think all those aspects which were key to the FDA guidance, a lot of them will get into the ICH. It'll be interesting, I suppose, on the edges to see how they deal with complex innovative designs, things like Bayesian aspects, and some of the more, say, controversial, well, not controversial, but the kind of more ambiguous aspects right now, because I think they will need to have something in there about those, but I would imagine probably won't be too strong. But those basic principles, pre-specification, simulation, albeit there might be some pushback in simulation from the EMA, they tend to be less friendly to it, though I think that is changing. And early engagement, I think those will probably be, once again, the core things, as well as talking about some of the specific designs, which are kind of very uncontroversial, like group structure design, etc. Lots of examples, hopefully. And, that's probably the biggest development I would see for adaptive design specifically. But adaptive design is really only one small area among the much wider area of kind of the increasing complexity of trials at the confirmatory stage, interacting with things like the usage of real world evidence, interacting with the increased usage of Bayesian statistics, and interacting with a just general more openness to trial designs, which aren't just the kind of parallel two-arm trial, maybe with some interim analyses. And so one major way this is kind of coming across is through the complex innovative designs concept. Now, this is mostly FDA, but I think this terminology, complex designs, complex innovative designs, is kind of broadly becoming more and more accepted in other agencies as well. But this terminology specifically, CID, is very FDA focused right now. But this is basically just a broad term to kind of bring all of these type of statistical and design innovations under an umbrella and basically incorporate multiple novel design or analysis aspects. So novel might mean brand new, it might mean something that just hasn't been done much before, but in the context of clinical trials, means stuff that isn't well understood, to kind of use almost a controversial phrase from the initial draft guidance from the FDA on adaptive design from over a decade ago. But effectively, the nature of CID is itself evolving, it's changing over time, and that's admitted in the CID guidance published by the FDA I think a couple of years ago. And in effect, at the moment, this would include things like complex adaptations, so being able to adapt multiple things at the same time. So you might have covariate and response adaptive randomization, or enrichment and sample size re-estimation, or all that kind of aspects. Borrowing, which is really takes in the real world data, real world evidence, historical data, greater non-clinical data, all of these aspects, in putting them directly into the analysis aspects of the actual direct, the primary endpoint of your clinical trial. Obviously, this kind of stuff has value outside of that, but actually integrating that into the primary analysis, that's where borrowing using real evidence, historical data, becomes important. Bayesian aspects, obviously very important, and has a really big tie with the borrowing stuff. You're obviously talking about power priors and stuff like that when you want methods which can integrate prior data more easily. That's much easier within the Bayesian paradigm than the frequentist paradigm on average, I would say, where frequentist is usually some type of pooling effectively. And then you have master protocols, which is really just the wider umbrella trials, basket trials, and platform trials. Like those first two terms, basket, umbrella, very strongly associated with oncology, and umbrella and platform in terms of what they actually mean are very self-similar, I would say. They both just mean you have multiple treatments and you want to evaluate them over time. The platform has kind of been used outside of oncology more, I would say, and also pays homage to the fact that there's usually much more interest in this platform existing for a longer period of time, with treatments coming in and out over time. And I would say there's no unifying aspect for these. And I suppose, as I said in a second, what will happen when these become well understood, to use that phrase again. But I think one thing that unifies them right now, broadly, I would say, is that these methods are strongly associated, where the requirement would be that you would have to do very comprehensive simulation to verify the operating characteristics of the designs in confirmatory trials, particularly, which CID is mostly about confirmatory trials in the FDA lexicon. Type 1 error control will be very important. Bias will be very important, but type 1 error too is kind of important. I think there's a little back and forth, like, is type 1 error really that important? But we'll actually get onto that in a moment, in terms of the impact of Bayesian approaches. But type 1 error right now is very important, so you need to verify that by simulation. So you just verify under the null that you still get only a 2.5% chance of rejecting the null or finding for success. And so the hope is that the CID concept program, basically both, is it can provide a potential method and openness to innovation that should hopefully improve trials feasibility. And I think in particular, there's a great desire within the FDA, within the regulatory and legislative context, both, and that's also in Europe as well, to trying to meet unmet needs. So that's things like rare diseases, things like pediatrics, which is often kind of associated, those kind of areas where, traditional clinical trial, like, the gold standard or CT, it doesn't quite map as well onto that. And indeed, someone like Luis Rojas, who presented a webinar on estimands here last year, his consultancy does a lot of work on that team. INCSD is the name of the consultancy firm. And the things that he talks about when we're going back and forth, really interesting stuff happening in this area. And I think, it's not really related to this, but I think it'll be interesting to me to see like how the process of going from a complex approach to a well understood approach, or an accepted approach, or a non-complex approach, however you want to describe it, like the graduation of these methods from this kind of program to being actually we understand this quite well, here's the protocol for how you should use these methods. It'll be interesting to see how that develops. Like, that process is very much in flux right now, and I think maybe they'll never kind of formally ever happen, but it'll be interesting to see the kind of graduation process, for lack of a better term. As I say, rare diseases, you might see certain methods become standard from the CID program for rare diseases, because it's well understood that the classic ORCT doesn't make sense there. So in terms of trends, so obviously the CID guidance document, which kind of was strongly associated with the paired meetings program, where I think they're taking on, they take on multiple sponsors every quarter to the CID program. It was published in 2020, and I think broadly has been seeing success. Not perfect, as usual, there's some debate and back and forth, maybe more resources and get this done quicker. But I think overall people have been very happy with this and consider it a very major step forward for the amount of collaboration and acceleration in what isn't possible in confirmatory trials. And so the FDA has published multiple case studies. The website for this is in the references at the end. You can see all the case studies there. And in effect, they've talked about examples which use Bayesian borrowing, talk about examples which use the master protocol, kind of platform type trial. And these are all really exciting and very interesting, and hopefully should provide a template going forward. I don't know if that constitutes graduation. You'd have to ask them from the FDA, but it certainly gives an indication of where the direction of traffic is going in terms of what is kind of being people are happy with and what people aren't happy with. And just a small mention that that advice on complex design isn't just limited to the paired meetings program. Under the PDUFA 7 letter, the FDA did say that they're happy to provide advice on these types of complex approaches in the traditional channels, via the normal approval process. And so there's been a lot of interesting developments over the last year, and some of those will obviously have an impact going forward. I think one area which saw a huge boost, and like just to say, the FDA, the EMA, like they're putting out lots of stuff right now. There's so much excitement, but in terms of feresources, they could perhaps do a few more resources to get through their workload quicker. The kind of worksheet for what is on the agenda, even within this area alone, is pretty substantial. And just based on the legislative, in the FDA's case, some of the legislative deadlines that they have, both from PDUFA but also the FDORA. Real world evidence is a huge area where you saw substantial things. So there's a program here that's kind of separate from the CID, but I assume there's often some relations of advancing the real world evidence in clinical trials going forward. And then you saw two big guidances, probably the one of most interest to clinical trials for biologics and drugs is this one, considerations for the use of RWE, real world data and real world evidence to support regulatory decision making, obviously giving a really great context right now for some ideas of what the best way of using this is. And then externally controlled trials is kind of a similar concept, which talk about synthetic control arms and things like that. So obviously, if you're not aware, the guidelines aren't binding. It's not like these force you to do a certain thing or behind your hands, but these kind of provide the contours of the thinking of regulatory agencies in terms of what makes sense. And then in March 2024, there's a workshop on advancing the use of complex innovative designs, and this is part of a wider push broadly, both from the legislative agenda and from within the kind of the FDA's own commitments to ensuring that these approaches these complex approaches, Bayesian statistics, real world evidence, complex adaptive designs, they continued their acceleration, continued momentum going forward. And then the one, as a statistician, it's hard not to kind of have the eye towards 2025, where by 2025, I think it's Q2 if I recall correctly, the FDA has made a commitment to have the first draft guidance published for the use of Bayesian methodology in clinical trials, and that's presumably referring mostly to confirmatory trials where the excitement is. And obviously there could or could not be a major paradigm shift there. The whole discussion around 2.5% and all that kind of stuff, I'm sure will come up, and there'll be lots of strong debates, I'm sure, on the various forums and Twitter, etc. But yeah, it's some interesting stuff happening here in this complex innovative design trend space. One area that's really kind of having a lot of momentum just already, kind of separate from the CID program, is platform trials, because they're not, both ones which are for confirmatory, but more excitingly for kind of off-label usage stuff. And platform trials are basically trials where you have this kind of idea of a almost perpetual master protocol, or this idea of a long-lasting platform where effectively you create the clinical trial infrastructure, and then you're basically adding and dropping arms based on the evidence as you go forward. And so rather than having to, every time you want to approve a drug or find a use for a drug, you don't have to go back to square one. You have this platform. And then I think particularly in public health or for public agencies, this could have a really big impact on the space of things that could be evaluated. If we could reduce costs of just trying things out and trying out existing medicines, then hopefully that can lead to lots of existing medicines finding new usages, providing real value to patients, and obviously reducing disease burden. And of course, this is highly associated with the kind of master protocol term. And just to say, obviously, umbrella and basket trials within oncology will continue to be a major factor, but platform trials are probably the ones that have the greatest impact over a wider range of clinical areas at the moment. And of course, the idea here is that you could reduce costs, you increase flexibility, you have a shared control. Like that alone could probably save you a fair whack of patience and time. And the hope here is that this efficiency will lead to more things getting to patients, more useful things getting to patients faster. And there's obviously many examples successful already. Stampede, which actually finished recruiting in 2023, though I assume valuations will continue for a while longer. In the context of prostate cancer, probably the pivotal trial in platform trials. There's so many offshoots in terms of research and interest from Stampede. It's a testament to the research done there that's like really set the tone for what isn't possible in terms of these platform trials. I-SPY, another famous early one, a more recent one would be ALS Healy. And then COVID-19 was really like a superstar moment for platform trials. Many of the therapeutics were found to have efficacy during the COVID-19 pandemic, like dexamethasone, were found by platform trials like Recovery and REMAP-CAP. So, that is the kind of proof of concept that people got really excited about. And there's been a number of initiatives initiated over the last 2 years or so that hopefully will start bearing major fruit across a wide variety of areas in the upcoming years. And so, that recent successes, and which build on that almost now decade plus of experience in figuring out all the questions of how this is going to work, both in terms of operational aspects, but also the statistical aspects. Really exciting, because you had so much growth in 2023, and obviously, clinical trials take some time, but hopefully we'll see some of these innovations make forward. And I said in terms of public health, evaluating especially like generics or off-label medicines at the moment, this could really be a revolution. I think in terms of 2024 and going forward, I think one area which I think I'm very interested in, probably as a statistician, I'm a little bit biased, is like, okay, we have ideas of how these work and we have successful examples, but where are we going to converge in terms of like the optimal approaches, the best approaches? Because I think there's a lot of debate between I think everyone agrees the value of the platform mostly comes from the platform itself. But then there's kind of like, can you eke out an extra maybe 5, 10, 15% efficiency by having a more sophisticated approach to the analysis aspects of the platform trial? So, you have simple platforms, which is basically just using the platform to do a number of concurrent parallel trials. So effectively, an arm is added for a period of time, then you do a statistical analysis as if that had just been a clinical trial itself. It's just like its own little pocket universe effectively. And then there's adaptive aspects, like stopping, having interim analyses, so you can remove arms earlier than just the final endpoint for them, and so adding and dropping arms via that mechanism. And a lot of interesting papers in the last 2 years on the arm adding aspect, particularly from, I believe, UCL, and talking about how to do that within mostly a frequentist framework. And then I think, there's certain people like Remap Cap associated with Berry Consultants very strongly pushing the idea of the Bayesian approach, which obviously sequential analyses and these more flexible analyses tend to play nicer within the Bayesian approach. So you have these kind of Bayesian hierarchical models, and that not only opens up the aspects related to more like kind of using Bayesian success criterions like posterior errors and stuff like that, but also interest in kind of taking in non-concurrent priors and non-concurrent controls and things like that, which is much harder in other contexts. And then because you can use pooling in the frequentist framework, but within the Bayesian, you could use that using a power prior or something similar, and then kind of weight that non-concurrent controls appropriately based on the information available to you. And so, lots of interesting. I think one area where we're starting to see a bit more certainty is if we're talking about, obviously, if we're talking about drug approvals, you're still probably going to be within the 0.025 type 1 error, the frequentist paradigm. And multiplicity adjustment, the emerging consensus, I would say, over the last year or so, is that if the arms are related, so if they're different dose levels or if they're combinations, some level of multiplicity adjustment may be required. So like the false discovery rate might be appropriate for combinations. You might need a stronger error control if you're talking about doses, where there's obviously kind of a strong correlation. But that if you have different treatments, like they're just like 5 independent treatments, they have no relations, like you have a steroid here and an antibiotic here or whatever. I don't know why they'd be treating the same thing, but let's just say lots of different types of treatments that are distinct, that multiplicity adjustment is not required. Now, there's a little back and forth in this because of the shared control arm, there is some induced correlation between the endpoints, and there is some increase in the type 1 error on average. But the general consensus is that this is small, and that if we were to introduce multiplicity adjustment in that case, it would ask some kind of broader questions about how clinical trials happen. Why is it that if we're kind of comparing 5 treatments within a platform, we need to do a multiplicity adjustment, but if we were to do 5 separate clinical trials, we would not need to do adjustment? It's really, I think that shared control aspect is kind of the last, I'd say the last barrier, and I think it's, I would say on average it's probably falling over. I think, especially given the wider context in terms of openness to innovation. And then I think in terms of open questions, the best mechanism to add and drop arms, I think that intersects with which statistical approach to use. Non-concurrent controls, very important. I think, it'll definitely add value. And it's like, some people argue you're throwing data away by not using the non-concurrent controls, but I think there's going to be a lot more back and forth. And I think that's one of the more controversial aspects in terms of getting a consensus on whether to do it or not. I think control changing within the trial. So obviously within a trial, if within that platform trial itself or within some external trial, you find that the standard treatment changes from X to Y, if you change that control, how does that affect the usage of the trial itself? Like how does that affect the statistical properties, etc., of the trial itself by changing control midstream, especially if there's some arms that you can continue before and after that change. And then trial integrity, I think it's one of those kind of interesting questions because we want platform trials to provide results quickly, but there are some biases that can be created by the fact that if that if, for example, if what's happening on the control arm at an interim analysis, as part of a readout, that could give you like a little bit biased. Like if that control arm is a little bit lower than expected, then you might be biased to go, oh, let's go into that platform trial over another platform trial, because obviously it's slightly lower just due to random variation. That's one that's just due to that aspect might be more likely to give you a successful result on average. So some trial integrity aspects need to be teased out as well. But I think broadly, the value of this has been shown already, in Stampede, iSpy already over a decade, and then in the COVID-19, these huge successes like Recovery. So I think, there's lots of money being thrown at this. There's lots of interest from regulators. And I think, you've seen the EMA published a concept paper on platform trials. I think they just completed the EU Peril project, which was about this and complex design in general. So I think, much more openness there. And then the FDA, I think it's on their agenda. Whether that happens in 2024 or 2025, we'll see. But basically, a master protocols agenda for drug development and biological products in general is coming. Basically, it's on the list that they publish of the things they're considering. And I would say most likely it will build off a lot of the things from the oncology master protocol guidance from 2022 that was finalized in 2022. But I think the operational aspects is maybe where you'd see a bit more detail and a bit more interest over the kind of master protocol in oncology. Focus a lot on these kind of umbrella trials, not these kind of long-running platforms as much. So, within Enquiry, We're obviously very interested in adaptive design. We're very interested in Bayesian analysis. I provided a couple of examples here in the slides, and I've also done a few examples at NCRE of some of the more recent developments. So group sequential design, in 2023, we did a complete overhaul of group sequential design from the ground up, adding in a number of additional statistical analyses from just the error spending approach, including traditional ones like Habital Pedo, some of the rare ones like Unified Family, and we also added in even fully custom group sequential designs where you can basically input a series of p-values, z-values, score values, effect size values, and just kind of get the group sequential operating characteristics. In addition, we've added a kind of new UI approach where effectively within the side table, you will get within the same panel the report, boundary plots, being able to save and transfer these across, etc. And these can obviously be changed to different scales as well. So this was a major step forward for NCRE, not only in terms of what we can offer statistically for group design, but also for the kind of what we'll be doing for more complex methods going forward in terms of how the UI will approach them. And then, a few years ago, we added the multi-arm, multi-stage designs, and we're also looking, this is a major area of interest going forward. Both these examples have been covered in previous webinars. So if you're interested in them, feel free to email us, and I'll be happy to share the snippets from these, from the webinars or the full webinar on these topics. And the save files themselves will also be provided afterwards if you're interested in exploring these further. So that's complex in the design, and obviously at NCRE, that's probably the one we're a little bit biased towards, because obviously NCRE is focused on clinical trial design and these areas. But obviously, there's lots of other exciting stuff happening in clinical trials this year and beyond. And so, as I mentioned earlier, increased failure rates, higher costs, difficulty in getting to, certain, underserved patient communities, people with rare diseases, pediatrics, etc. And I think, a big approach here is that emerging technologies alongside complex designs and many other aspects can help alleviate these issues. They're not going to cure everything. They're not going to fix everything overnight. I think, the clinical trials, the aspects of them that are good, the things that they provide robust evidence that treatments work. We don't want to go back to the days of thalidomide. We don't want to go, to a situation with like supplements in the US where, it's a free for all. We're not going back there. So, big questions require big resources to answer, but maybe they've got a little bit too big in terms of the research issues, and these things can help alleviate that to a certain extent. I think, when we're talking about real patients within a clinical trial, and we're talking about real patients who will get a therapy, some big expense is expected and should be expected, but, let's try and alleviate that. And so technology is one of the ways that we could hopefully alleviate that. And there's indeed a meeting being sponsored by the FDA in March 2024 on enhancing adoption of innovative clinical trials approaches. The link for that it should be in the slides, but you can also just search for the string and it should bring up the event details. I believe registration is open now. And obviously, as I said, there's a number of other trends ongoing where technology could be a potential way to, improve these aspects. I think, more representative trials is a big concern. I think there's diversity plan guidance published, I believe this year, or sorry, not last year, and there was also the EU clinical trials regulation. They both focused on increasing diversity, and obviously the idea there is that, clinical trials tend to recruit from a fairly wealthy cohort. They tend to be biased towards the US and the EU. That's changing though, especially with the success of international CROs. You're seeing more penetration into places like China. And all of these, and then just obviously within the US and EU, you tend to get more wealthy people on average. And so increasing diversity is certainly something people want to do clinical trials. I think it's also a major emphasis in post-marketing phase 4 type analysis as well. And of course, as I mentioned, pediatrics, rare disease are seeing a lot of interest. So 2 pediatric guidance from the FDA. The EMA is currently doing a pharmaceutical regulation overhaul that happens to go into these aspects as well, though that's currently kind of in the ether, a lot of back and forth in that within the EU institutions. But effectively, there's a lot of interest in increasing diversity and getting to these harder to reach patients at the moment, obviously just because either there's not very many of them or there is it's kind of, indications are usually based on adult data rather than child data for obvious reasons, because, anything that affects children, that it also affects adults, the risks to applying it to children are probably going to be slightly higher. And, emerging technologies alongside kind of the stuff we talked about earlier about like complex designs that obviously are attacking many of the same problems, is that these can hopefully broaden the reachable trial population, including vulnerable patients, and then also hopefully speed up and improve clinical trial routines, because clinical trials are huge beasts. They have so much work going on. Like, as a statistician, it's often easy for me to kind of abstract away to the statistics world, but the reality is that we're talking about so many people on the ground coordinating, working with patients to ensure that patients stay in the trial, the patients are engaged in the trial, that you get the right readouts, that the information is being collated and provided in the appropriate fashion. And obviously the regulations around that are huge, and you're seeing a lot of interest right now in the open source OR environment for kind of helping alleviate some of those issues. But today we're going to cover specifically AI, machine learning, and decentralized trials as two aspects which could provide help with both improving diversity and also speeding up and improving clinical trial processes. So AI, machine learning, of course, AI, kind of one of the buzzwords of 2023, obviously the impact of ChatGPT, and then in 2022, the image generators like Midjourney, like that's obviously having a huge impact on the public consciousness, and obviously huge aspects on wide variety of scenarios, but clinical trials is obviously one that you would expect to be affected as well. And of course, it's already having an impact in two main areas, I would say, that are related to clinical trials. One would be medical devices. Obviously, a bunch of AI medical devices or AI assisted medical devices or machine learning. Oftentimes, a lot of these would probably more accurately described as machine learning, to be frank, but AI is the buzzword. But medical devices which include AI machine learning aspects have already grown significantly. So I think 171 enabled AI ML enabled devices were logged by the FDA in up to 2023. I think that was actually a slight reduction, but that's still a very significant number, and gives precedent that there's going to be significant changes here. I'd say the biggest area is not, say medical devices, is actually in radiology. And so that indicates that like screening in particular is one area where AI ML seems to make a lot of sense. Like, there's always been interest in statistical methods that could take screening data and turn it more accurately, more quickly, more efficiently into the correct indication, disease present, disease not present. And AI ML seems like a perfect candidate given its success in general image recognition problems. And so that's already been ongoing for a number of years, and you're seeing many of those products come online. So lots of success there. But I think that being attached to remote to medical devices like in vitro ones that are like within the body in terms of providing constant outputs, and then also using those outputs to then provide warnings or to medical practitioners or to the patient that something's going on. Those are probably the more exciting paradigm or the frontier of AI ML at the moment. And in terms of the FDA EMA, like there's a lot of work published on AI, both in medical devices and in terms of clinical trials for drugs and biologics. In 2023, there was, I think, over the last few years, I think there was one on the one on drugs and biologics in particular. You might be interested. It's linked later on. But basically talking about all the different areas like digital twins, non-clinical data, manufacturing, analyzing post-marketing surveillance data, and kind of all these areas where the clinical trial is very strong at finding the relative effect, but there's all this additional data generated during clinical trial which is underused, which AI ML could potentially provide lots of data, not just within that trial, but potentially for future trials that could be very valuable. And that's all the benefits. Of course, there is some drawbacks. The EU just agreed in December to the AI Regulation Act, which I think there's some pushback from the medical devices industry because it's just there might be another track of regulation that'll just make their lives more difficult. And then the US, the president issued a executive order on AI, and I think there's obviously going to be drawbacks as well. Obviously, as there's the risk of more data going to just being more available. Data is now the new gold, blah blah blah, etc. If that data escapes, then that could have major implications. There's also security risks. I think particularly generative AI. So if you're talking about using AI to generate protocols, guidelines, other information like that, just ensuring that it's actually doing that accurately. Because of course, one of the biggest concerns in the early stages of this generative AI, for text at least, is the hallucination problem, where it's just generating facts from whole cloth, from nothing, that are untrue. So expect it to be a major area of interest. I think one area that's very exciting and probably has maybe a little bit less risk, because obviously this is at the start before you actually have to give it to patients in the clinical trial process, is drug discovery. And we're actually part of the larger Dotmatics family. Dotmatics is a major company in the provision of tools for understanding and your data and doing things like flow cytometry and all these kind of scientific processes. And they're very excited. We're very excited at the moment to talk about Dotmatics Luma, which is a platform for taking your data from scientific instruments, that's Lab Connect, kind of creating the data infrastructure where you can put all of your data into a single space, and then applying AI, ML across that to find new drug discoveries. So, I don't know how much I'm allowed to talk about, but I've seen some demos of this in the case of like small molecules and kind of searching across that. Huge interest in the case of proteins and other biologics, where obviously the complex, like we're already seeing in terms of public research, the impact on terms of like proteins and other biologics like this could make, because that's such a much more complex place where predicting what's going to happen for very small different conformations is very difficult. But the hope is that something like Dotmatics Luma can become the kind of future of kind of lab-based analysis for drug discovery, and kind of quicken up that process, kind of find new different areas that wouldn't have been thought of just by kind of human-based search, in the same way that Go has been revolutionized, chess has been revolutionized, well, to a lesser extent than Go, by AI coming into the picture and changing how we think about the game. And so, I think in terms of clinical trials specifically, the biggest area where you're seeing some immediate impacts, outside of medical devices, where it's obviously having an impact on what you're actually evaluating, is on the operations aspect. So I think in particular, there's a lot of interest in AI as being something which could provide scalable and responsive tools that could improve, selecting the right patients, recruit, and then obviously helping with recruitment of those patients, modeling the recruitment process, and giving, advice in terms of how you should, should we open up X number of hospitals, or which hospitals should be open, tools that help retain patients. So, if you have a ChatGPT, a generative AI type tool, then hopefully if patients have feedback or any questions, that could, reduce the burden, or help increase the efficiency in terms of that. So have the first level be automated response that's responsive to the patient and stuff like that, in terms of getting results from them, or getting feedback from them, or trying to have some back and forth to ensure they stay in the trial. And the hope is that that will then then the second level will be kind of human to human contact, kind of return for the kind of cases where it's most important. And of course, AI ML is just a great, modeling prediction tool that can be helped to better understand what you think is going to happen going forward. And as I said, generative AI probably a little bit more back and forth in this, but I think inevitably, there are certain aspects, certain guidelines, certain parts of the protocol that are fairly, generic, fairly, repetitive. And then the hope is that generative AI may assist a bit with that. But I think a little bit more carefulness there will probably be required, just because of the inflation. And I think the biggest potential here is in those kind of broad, complex areas. I think clinical trials will still be keenly focused in on the kind of primary endpoints, the current processes, to establish, like, is this drug better than this drug, using a robust approach like randomization that prevents you, minimizes the bias that can come into the process effectively. I think you need to have the surface area of what the clinical trial needs to be limited to a certain extent, to ensure that the kind of degrees of freedom available for shenanigans that's probably the poor word, but like the kind of sponsors kind of playing with things isn't too large. But in all these other areas like non-clinical data, post-marketing surveillance, the manufacturing process, these things naturally come into that. AI, I think, works best in the context in which there's lots of data, and in which the cost of a mistake is relatively low, or can be evaluated relatively quickly at low cost. Clinical trials, because obviously we're talking about real patients, giving them real drugs, and above and beyond the standard of care. That's where you don't want to have infinite number of people in clinical trial. You want to have a circumstantial management, because of course we don't know if the drug works yet. You need to be careful, and so traditional statistical principles, I think, will still strongly affect clinical trials. We're not going to suddenly start approving drugs based off AI ML approaches alone, in my opinion. At least for a very long time. But it can help supplement certain areas, like digital twins might be important in the context of rare diseases. And I think it will help with a lot of the other data being used better, and in contexts where data generation right now is very difficult, like in the post-marketing phase. And finally, just decentralized clinical trials. This is, I think there's I was at a very interesting webinar in December from Dr. Amy Rogers, who is a member of the Trials at Home project, which is a big project ongoing about decentralized clinical trials in the UK. And she was talking, this should be maybe patient-centered trials be better, or that these technologies we better talk about like how patients be centered. But decentralized clinical trials are obviously referring to the fact that rather than everything that's related to clinical trial happening in specific places, usually hospitals, so all of the data collection happens there. Patients have to go to the hospital, and then they get their treatment, they're evaluated, all of the things are all of the measurements are taken. That many of these aspects could be done remotely. And you have digital health technology and digital health endpoints as a offshoot of that. You can put on a lot of monitors onto someone. Like there's some technology is so available now, especially online technology, that you could just be able to monitor someone's heart rate, blood pressure, sugar levels, etc., etc., on a continual, ongoing basis using digital health technology. And then, as I said, there's interest in then creating endpoints, like primary endpoints or secondary endpoints in clinical trials based on those versus the kind of standard ones used at the moment. Telehealth, where basically the back and forth with clinicians or other members of the clinical trial happening online or via telephone. It's very important. Treatment delivery, so actually delivering the drug to the patient and allowing them to self-administer or administer with some other member, like a nurse or some other health professional who goes to them. E-consent, so obviously there's lots of bureaucracy and lots of important decisions and sign-ups that people need to make if they're going to join a clinical trial. Having that process happening online could obviously save just a lot of additional administration. And of course, COVID-19 led to a significant interest in decentralized clinical trials because during the hardest part of the pandemic, when effectively everything was shut down, a lot of trials either saw we need to go to this or did actually go to it and try to keep the trial going. And DCT was one of the few ways, and these technologies were one of the few ways that could actually keep going, and it provided a lot of really important lessons for DCT implementation and the potential and drawbacks of this approach to clinical trials. And the hope here is that DCTs can broaden our patient pool. So once again, thinking about those diversity targets, thinking about rare diseases, thinking about vulnerable patients. A DCT means that we can bring some of these things to you rather than you having to come to us being the people running clinical trial, us being the hospital. And the hope then is that we can improve the efficiency, the recruitment, the retention, because if the trial is responding to you and you have the ability to actually go out to them and bring things to them, maybe in response to like either at all times or in response to specific things happening to that patient, that offers a lot of value. But there are trade-offs. So effectively, generalizability versus suitability. So generalizability means that you could just do a lot more things. You could put on a whole bunch of different monitors, a whole bunch of different endpoints, but certain things won't be suitable. So I think, for example, oncology, there's much less penetration in oncology of DCTs because overall survival is considered such a central aspect of this that if you can't use these things as endpoints, maybe some of the value is reduced. So you're seeing it more in cardiology and other aspects where maybe the overall survival being the gold standard is less of an issue. Burden, obviously the benefits are obvious. You don't have to travel as much. You have more continuous monitoring, and hopefully everything's easier. But you don't have as much in-person help. Like these technologies may be complex. They may have certain aspects which are non-desirable. Like they might be quite loud when they have an emergency, or they might have like a noise, whatever like that. They might make noises, etc. They might be quite obvious to patients, and patients don't want people to know that they're currently hooked up to something. And just general assistance. Some technology might be more difficult for certain people based on their level of knowledge of technology or based on other considerations. So without having that in-person experience, without having the nurse or doctor or other professional there, there are certainly pushing all of the burden for all of these technologies onto the patient could have some cost. Safety. Obviously, if you have continuous monitoring, you're getting passive surveillance all of the time and finding things that otherwise, a junior doctor may not notice when they're being rushed back and forth helping out in the clinical trial. But obviously that face-to-face factor, I think people will miss it if they are part of trials. So I think in this case, maybe a hybrid approach may be suitable. Passive surveillance and maybe not as many visits, but some visits from health professionals make sense there if you're talking about this trade-off. And then equity, obviously the idea here is you're lowering costs. You don't have to have a car to go to the hospital anymore. Those kind of costs there, especially in remote areas. But obviously digital exclusion is a consideration. Like lots of people aren't comfortable with technology. How are you going to deal with that and ensure that these people are comfortable? Like you need to run training courses, or do you need to have some more hands-on approaches for those people who don't have access to the internet, don't have comfort with technology, etc. And I'd say, the views right now are very positive, given the need to reach these, more diverse populations, to reach vulnerable people, to reach people with rare diseases. And, you've already seen a draft guidance for DCTs published by the FDA in the middle of last year, and on digital health technologies as well earlier this year. The EMA published something towards the end of 2022. Those are draft guidances or position papers. So, lots of back and forth ongoing. I'm not sure if they'll be final guidance will come out in 2024, but they will come out within a reasonable period of time, you'd imagine. That was given. I think the broad feedback was that these were positive, that they were on the right track. So that usually indicates that you will see a final version perhaps this year. And obviously the changes between the draft and final version will be interesting to keep an eye on in terms of the view and the things. And then in terms of inquiry, like obviously I said, Domatix Luma is one of the big things in drug discovery, but we do have a number of tools for modeling enrollment processes, dropout processes in the case of survival trials, oncology trials, and these are in our Inquiry Predict suite of tools in our expert tier. And we've covered this in multiple webinars before, so if you're interested in this, these save files are provided if you want to investigate this yourself. But if you're interested in knowing more about Inquiry Predict, we're happy to provide some of the information on our website. So I'm not going to cover that today, but because I want to focus on the actual material today. But if you're interested, those are there, and you can see you can model on a per site basis. You might have the DCT sites versus the non-DCT sites if you were doing some kind of accrual modeling within Inquiry Predict, and kind of see what effect that have in terms of assumptions on your expected recruitment rate, etc. So I believe I'm pretty much out of time, so I'm not going to get any questions today, but do please put your questions in there, and I will answer all of them via email either later today or tomorrow. But I suppose in terms of the broad conclusions today, there's significant momentum to basically have a more open, innovative approach in clinical trials, taking on new technology, taking on new design types, taking on new statistical approaches. And all of this kind of is in the context of a wider legislative push for now over a decade in response to the increasing trial costs, the increasing failure rates, the kind of, the idea that things were slowing down in terms of innovation within pharmaceuticals, within health, public health, etc. Complex approaches to designing clinical trials will continue to be a major focus going forward. We've obviously seen like nearly 2 decades of development now of a major paradigm shift from the kind of classic, fixed term 2-arm RCT to a wide variety of other types of design in confirmatory trials in particular. Adaptive design should continue to grow in popularity. ICH E20, I think, it's just a major milestone. Anytime the ICH, the International Council for Harmonization, publishes something on here's how we think clinical trials should run, that is a major milestone in that aspect of the process of doing clinical trials. And adaptive design reaching that threshold is an indication of how it's reached a level of maturity and importance that isn't going away effectively. The CID idea / program will continue to evolve. We'll continue to see ideas of what isn't working in terms of innovative approaches to clinical trials at the phase 3, and obviously early stage. That's there's so much happening there. It could be its own webinar by itself. But in recent years, key developments in terms of platform trials, in terms of real-world evidence and real-world data, and then Bayesian, I think that's right across the horizon. Keep an eye out for any kind of rumors, reports that come in, and I can basically guarantee you this time next year, I will probably be talking about Bayesian clinical trials, Bayesian approaches to clinical trials, because that's going to be a huge thing for 2025. And it's a platform trials, huge growth already. Maybe we'll start seeing some of the major outputs of the newer ones that kind of emerged during the COVID-19 gold rush. But statistical design aspects, keep an eye on the debates around those, on which ones kind of win out in the kind of the race, the kind of marketplace of ideas. Emerging technologies, very much valuable, especially in relation to improving trial diversity, retention, and recruitment. AI, machine learning, already having a direct impact on medical devices and drug discovery, and I think on the operational aspects of clinical trials and improving their retention and recruitment and modeling stuff in general, and using non-clinical sources of data. Lots of value there. And decentralized clinical trials should hopefully provide a much wider options for trialists when dealing with a wider diversity of types of patients, particularly like even vulnerable infirm patients. I think this is the kind of technology which could hugely improve their capacity to be involved in clinical trials and get drugs that are important for that community out there in a much less burdensome manner. Just with the final few moments, just want to mention that if you aren't a user of Encri, or if you don't have access to the more complex parts of Encri, like the expert predict here, you could try those for free for 14 days by just using your email at statsalz.com/trial. There's no credit cards, nothing like that. Literally, you'll put your email in and you'll get a link back where you can try Encri within your browser for 14 days. So very simple, very easy. And if you have any questions that you want to ask me or the company in general after this webinar, you can email us at info@statsalz.com. You can also go to our website, statsalz.com, where we actually have a number of resources that might be of interest. We have templates, which basically go through examples with a video clip and the save file. We have PDF examples at the examples spreadsheet there. And all the previous webinars are available at statsalz.com/webinars. After all the ones from 2023, 2022, and I believe 2021 have been archived there. And as I said, those included ones on group sequential design and things like prediction as well. So some of the examples I showed there are from those. You could see them in more detail in those archives where those were the actual subject. And as mentioned, I provided references at the end of these slides, which will be provided to you afterwards alongside this recording, that go through the different aspects, including all of the FDA and EMA guidances and papers that I've referenced here today, as well as some academic references as well. So as I said, I think we've run over a little bit of time here, so I'm going to finish up. But as I say, if you have any questions, you can email us at info@statsalz.com. And the questions that you have asked here today, I can see there's a couple, I will answer via email afterwards. So obviously you will get your response there. So yeah, without any further ado, I want to thank you so much for attending today. I hope this was an interesting look at what might happen in 2024. Hopefully I won't turn out to be too inaccurate, that my prediction model will turn out to be sufficient. But I think it's a really exciting time in clinical trials. There's a lot of interesting stuff happening, and here at Encri, we're hoping to just provide you a small section, a small flavor of that through our webinar series, and hopefully with improvements in our software in 2024 and beyond. So without any further ado, thank you again so much for attending, and I'll talk to you again soon.